It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Schultz Grand Atrium here at the University of St. Thomas School of Law. My name is Dan Kelly, and I serve as Dean and Mengler Chair here at the St. Thomas Law School. First off, a big thank you to everyone for joining us, and a big thank you to our staff who worked diligently to prepare this program. We're super excited that the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing has put together a distinguished panel and an unbelievable keynote today. The Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing has done great work since its founding, tackling difficult issues from the Catholic sex abuse crisis to issues of racial justice to global crises around the world. It's an especially important time to talk about today's topic for our country and for the Catholic Church. That's especially true with many difficult issues that we're facing and that Catholic social teaching and restorative justice can provide key insights on. It's also especially appropriate, I think, given Pope Leo XIV, the new Pope, being an American Pope and engaged on these issues, and also given that he took the name Leo XIV, many people have discussed that Leo XIII was very involved early on with Catholic social teaching issues, especially the encyclical Rerum Novarum in 1891. And so these issues are coming and percolating to the forefront, and there's no better organization addressing them today than the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing. Because the insights from Catholic social teaching, including the recognition of the individual and their human dignity, topics like subsidiarity and solidarity and justice, and our call to serve the poor, the most vulnerable, and really anyone we encounter will be crucial to tackling these difficult social issues. To kick things off, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing, Father Dan Griffith. So in brief, Father Dan is the Wenger Family Faculty Fellow, the law school chaplain, and as I said, the founding director of the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing here at the law school, where he teaches an array of classes including restorative justice, Catholic social thought, and jurisprudence. In addition, he also serves as the pastor and rector of the Basilica of St. Mary's and just hosted a great event last night, the Link Distinguished Lecture with Dr. Carolyn Wu. Congratulations, Father Dan, on that. And he serves as the Archdiocesan Liaison for Restorative and Justice and Healing. In other words, Father Dan is very busy. But the thing I truly admire about Father Dan, two things actually. One is almost anytime he speaks, definitely anytime he preaches, he always is fond of reminding us that God loves you. God loves each and every one of us. And he's a model of the culture of encounter, which President Rob Vischer, mirroring Pope Francis, reminds us is the key to all of our interactions with students, staff, faculty, and all of our colleagues. So Father Dan, thank you so much for hosting this program, and I give it to you to start the introductions.
Thank you to Dean Kelly for his presence, for saying yes to the Holy Spirit, which we think, of course, brought Dan and Kate and their family to the Twin Cities, and he's just doing a terrific job, and I appreciate that. The initiative, I'm going to just take a few minutes before Christopher gives his keynote to just talk a little bit about the Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing, its focus, how it came about, and a little bit on Catholic social teaching. The Initiative on Restorative Justice and Healing was launched in September of 2021 with then Dean Robert Vischer fully in support, Dean of the Law School at this point, and now our president. IRJH seeks to name and help heal harm that comes from institutional and leadership failures, racial injustice, and polarization in society and in the church. Our initiative also seeks to educate law students and lawyers on how to integrate restorative justice principles and practices and values into legal practice. Our restorative justice course that Julie Craven and I teach has been full every one of the last number of years, and we find that really encouraging. One of the highlights of the semester is when students go to Stillwater Prison, where they take part in a Restorative Justice 101 course that is taught by the incarcerated men. Since our 2021 launch, IRJH has hosted a national consultation on healing the harm of clergy abuse, including 4 bishops, including Archbishop Hebda, and experts from various and related fields and survivors as well. 2 years ago, we co-hosted the first in-person National Catholic Restorative Justice Conference right here at UST Law. And it was so moving to see this grassroots movement in the Catholic Church here at our law school. Just recently in Atlanta, they hosted another version of this last weekend. As we move to our 5th anniversary next fall of our launch, we are so heartened and thankful and attribute really the movement of the Holy Spirit guiding us. I'm so moved by what we've been able to offer and what we've been able to glean from this work. And also give credit to St. Mary's intercession. It was on the birthday of St. Mary that we chose to launch our initiative, and we feel her intercession. So what is restorative justice? It is often misunderstood, and the knowledge gap around RJ is one of the significant challenges for greater use. Restorative justice is a philosophical and practical approach to harm that is survivor-centered. That's its main aim. Historically, it is rooted in the practices and cultures of First Nation peoples of North America and New Zealand, pre-colonial Africa, and elsewhere. Restorative justice has become a worldwide movement because it is effective in healing harm. And practitioners, Janice Anderson, myself, and others have seen it work. It's a beautiful thing to see when harm is healed, people come together. It's not easy, it's messy, it takes a lot of time, but it holds tremendous potential for healing harm. It involves multiple stakeholders and is consistent with our social and human nature, which is oriented to flourishing and, when harmed, to healing. IRJH is grounded in the Catholic intellectual and tradition and Catholic social teaching in terms of our initiatives approach. We have found that when RJ and Catholic social teaching are paired, a potent synergy emerges because of the shared values of restorative justice and Catholic social teaching, but also their similar methodologies. Catholic social teaching is a moral and ethical framework sourced in faith, reason, and experience that puts forth fundamental principles to foster a more just and humane social order and to advance personal and collective flourishing. Our panelists will further expound on Catholic social teaching and its potential to bridge divides and bring peace. The election of Cardinal Robert Prevost as successor to St. Peter and Pope of the Catholic Church was a surprise to many, but not all. On the loggia of St. Peter on May 8th, our new Pope, Pope Leo, spoke of building bridges and of fostering greater unity and peace in the Church and in society. We know there is great need to heal wounds in the Church and to overcome polarization, which Leo has spoken of often in his first days and months as Pope. Our new Pope signaled an emphasis on Catholic social teaching by taking the name, as Dean Kelly noted, of Pope Leo XIV, Pope Leo XIII being the father of modern Catholic social teaching and a very influential Pope. I think Leo's emphasis on unity and peace also speak to the desire for healing in the Church and outside the Church. I was struck that Dr. Carolyn Wu noted last night at the Basilica of St. Mary what the Twin Cities community has experienced. And once again, it hit me and others who were there what we've all experienced, the killing of George Floyd 5 years ago, the assassination of the Hortmans, and the really assassination of those 2 dear children, the killing of our dear children at Annunciation Catholic school. This has been a challenging time for the Twin Cities, but with God's grace, we can build up our communities, and Catholic social teaching and restorative justice can help in that regard. With regard to Pope Leo, I was struck, and I sent this article to our panelists, by a statement that was read in Peru. There was an abusive order that did great damage. It was eventually suspended right before Pope Francis went to the Lord. And Pope Leo, then Prevost, had a significant role in that. But as importantly, he walked with survivors. The reporting has now been very clear with regard to that. And only somebody who walks with survivors could have written what he did that was read in Peru in his name. It's a sign of hope, friends. Today we have a terrific panel to help us explore Toward Justice and Peace, Pope Leo XIV, Catholic social teaching, and restorative justice. And first off, and I would say this all about our panelists, and this is one of the reasons why I reached out to this group, extraordinary giftedness, all four of them, fantastic deep faith, and rich humanity. This is how these four approach their important work in the church, and it has an impact indeed. So first up, we're going to hear from Christopher White. Chris finished up this past spring. He was the Rome correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. And I don't know how he did it, but in a 2 or 3 week period of time, after the conclave, he somehow had time to write a book. I think it almost killed him. Christopher is now at the Georgetown Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life. We thank them. They are co-sponsoring our event. And so we welcome all those who are joining us online, wherever you might be. And so I'll get to Chris's bio in a minute, but I want to thank the GHR Foundation, who is sponsoring this event and the reception and all of our speakers as well. And I thank the Basilica of St. Mary, which is also a co-sponsor. Christopher White is the Associate Director and Senior Fellow of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. He is the author of the newly released book, Pope Leo XIV, Inside the Conclave and the Dawn of a New Papacy. And there are books there. You're welcome to take a book with you. Christopher has signed them. You are also welcome to make a gift to the Initiative on Catholic Social Teaching, but of course it's a gift. You're not required to do that. But the books are there. It's a great read. I love his summary of Pope Francis's legacy and really the entire book. So thank you to Chris for that work. Chris is the former Vatican correspondent, as I mentioned, and also a former reporter for Crux. He has regularly appeared on television and radio programs, including CNN, NPR, NBC, and BBC, and as a Vatican analyst for NBC and MSNBC. So interestingly, Chris not only had a great profile of Cardinal Prevost before the election, he also, before the conclave, before the election, predicted that it could be Prevost. And not everybody agreed with him, but we welcome Chris White. We thank him for being here from New York, and please warmly welcome him to the stage. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Father Dan. Since I realize I'm keeping everyone from the bar, I'll try to be brief. Father Dan invited me and these very distinguished panelists, and they're far more interested and talented than myself, but it's great to be here. And I'm embarrassed to admit that this is my first time in Minnesota. And yesterday I was thinking about that, and I've covered the Catholic Church for about a decade. And so I'm very much aware of both the hurt, but also the dynamism of this local church. So it's a real honor to be here. So thank you for having me. But when I was thinking about this being my inaugural visit to Minnesota, it reminded me of a joke that kind of reverberates around Rome. And it kind of goes like this. There are different variations of it. But the idea is that the Holy Trinity had won a free trip. and they had to decide where they could go. And God the Father said, I'd like to go to Africa to be with those who are suffering. Jesus said, I want to go to Palestine to go back to my roots. And the Holy Spirit said they wanted to go to the Vatican. And when asked why, the Holy Spirit responded, because I've never been there. Now, my task this afternoon is to briefly set the stage for a larger conversation about this new pontificate, which of course Catholics believe the Holy Spirit was very much involved in. But Father Dan asked me to begin by just he said, tell a few stories to give us a sense of what was happening in the lead up to this papal election and why it matters. And so that's what I'll try to do. I think most Americans have sort of gotten used to hearing some form of the expression that the next presidential election is the most important in the history of our country. We've heard that a lot, I think. The same can't really be said for papal elections, which in various forms go back for about 2 millennia. But before the 133 cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel on May 7th, several of them had told me that they believed that the conclave of 2025 might be the most important in at least 60 years. In my book, which Father Dan has kindly promoted, I open with a comparison to the Second Vatican Council and Pope John XXIII's death of stomach cancer in June of 1963. Just 1 year earlier, Pope John had presided over the opening of the Second Vatican Council, which was a landmark event in the history of our church. This council promised to open up the church to the modern world, and when the council was announced in January of 1959, the news sent shockwaves through Rome and throughout the world. Councils are rare in the life of the church, and at the time of what would come to be called Vatican II, there'd only been 20 previous councils, each of them marked with great promise and great trepidation. Speaking to the nearly 2,500 bishops from all over the world at the start of the council in 1962, Pope John said that it was time for the church to, quote, look to the present, to the new conditions and new forms of life introduced into the modern world, which have opened up new avenues to the Catholic apostolate. While many past councils in the church had been inward-looking, the Second Vatican Council was decidedly outward-facing. As one observer wrote after the first session, quote, I hadn't realized that anything like this existed. I thought the Roman Catholic Church was a very closed, complacent, sectarian body that had nothing to learn from anybody else. I now know that this is no longer accurate, if it ever was. The whole atmosphere is so different that it's a real miracle. All of that was at stake following the death of Pope John XXIII in the summer of 1963. Would the cardinals elect a pope who would push ahead with the reforms of the council, or would they reverse course, afraid of the possibility that decades and even centuries of tradition might be undone? The conclave of 1963 would challenge all of this, and on the eve, the New York Times declared that, quote, in modern times, there's never been a papal election so important as the one that starts in Rome tomorrow. And then, on June the 21st in 1963, when Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini emerged from that conclave, taking the name Pope Paul VI, it's in a signal that the reforms set in motion by John XXIII would continue. The former Cardinal of Milan had been an ally of John XXIII, and though very different in personality and disposition, John XXIII was sort of gregarious and winsome, and Pope Paul VI, Montini, was much more sort of a studied figure. He had still been deeply engaged in the first session of the council. He was supportive of the larger project, but he knew that the council would lead to a reckoning for the global institution. In fact, on the night that it was announced, Cardinal Montini called a friend of his and said of Pope John, quote, this holy old boy doesn't realize what a hornet's nest he's stirring up. By the end of Francis's papacy, some of the Pope's own cardinals had also begun to characterize it in similar terms, sometimes even using more pointed descriptions. Australian Cardinal George Pell, before his own death in 2023, had penned a secret memo that labeled the Francis papacy a catastrophe, and he was actively promoting candidates that would bring back a sense of law and order inside the Vatican's governance. There was also Cardinal Gerhard Müller, the former head of the Vatican's doctrinal office, who went as far in his public criticisms to imply that Francis might have drifted into heresy for allowing priests to offer blessings to those in same-sex unions. I, however, argue in my book that Francis, for his entire papacy, could be seen as 50 years later trying to implement the reforms of the council initiated by his predecessors. The Second Vatican Council had unleashed tremendous change in the life of the Church. Among its landmark reforms were greater participation of the laity in the life of the Church, the start of a new era in the Church's relations with other religions, a deeper commitment to religious liberty and pluralism, and a call for a style of governance marked by collegiality. Above all, the Council committed the Church to be more engaged and open to the world around it. And yet, for a number of reasons, the Council's embrace of these reforms was rather sluggish. There had been quite a bit of internal resistance, and two popes had sustained a rather narrow understanding of the Council's aims. Yet in his first major document as Pope in 2013, Francis turned to the Council and anchored his entire papacy in its call for, quote, an ecclesial conversion as openness to a constant self-renewal born of fidelity to Jesus Christ. In the 12 years that followed, Francis pursued that vision by radically reorienting the Church's priorities. He demonstrated this commitment through several ways by insisting that the Church focus less on sexual ethics, while at the same time showing its equal commitment to the needs of migrants and refugees and those facing environmental disaster. He put women in positions of high-ranking authority in the Vatican for the first time ever, and he began to dismantle the papal court that had long defined the institution. And by launching a global synod process in 2021, meant to invite Catholics from around the world to bring their joys, anxieties, and hopes, and to consider the ways in which the whole Church might listen to them. Outside of the Church, these changes were largely received with thunderous reception. In 2013, Pope Francis was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year, who labeled him, quote, the People's Pope for his courage in changing the often archaic and antiquated institution. Inside of the Church, however, a hornet's nest had been rattled. And this past May, when the cardinals from around the world gathered to elect Francis' successor, they were effectively facing a referendum, as they did 60 years earlier, as to whether or not to continue on the path of reform. Following the death of a pope, cardinals from around the world had one main job. It's to get to Rome to begin to decide who the next pope will be. This conclave was to be the largest and most diverse in the history of the Catholic Church, with over 70 countries represented. 80% of the men in that room had never even been a part of a conclave before, so there was a rather steep learning curve. And immediately the spotlight began to fall on a few leading candidates known as papabulae, potential popes. There was Cardinal Parolin, Pope Francis' longtime Secretary of State, who was seen as a great diplomat, but he lacked pastoral experience, but it's fair to say that he went into the conclave as the real favorite, just simply based on name recognition alone. There was Cardinal Tagle from the Philippines, often referred to as the Asian Pope Francis because of his focus on humility and love of the poor. There was Cardinal Grech, the head of the Vatican Synod Office, who was seen as a standard bearer for synodality, who could perhaps carry on synodality if the cardinals wanted to really focus on that. There was Cardinal Jean-Marc Aveline from France, who had an interesting bio as someone born in Algeria, grew up in France, and had focused on migration. And then there was Cardinal Robert Prevost, an American. Now, Cardinal Robert Prevost was not a very well-known figure throughout the rest of the Church, and he didn't make most of the short list in the time of the conclave. And many people thought that he was a no-go from the start because of his passport. In 2022, when Cardinal Robert McElroy, the now Archbishop of Washington, D.C., was asked about the possibility of an American one day being elected Pope, he bluntly dismissed the idea. He said, quote, "I don't think an American should be Pope, and I would oppose any American being elected." The United States, he said, had too much power in the world, and an American being elected to the papacy would only add to that power and diminish the global perspective that the head of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics needed in governing a universal church. And McElroy's position had been historically shared by the majority of the College of Cardinals. Many of the cardinals that were suspicious of America were in fact a bit unnerved by the behavior of President Donald Trump, who just a few days before the conclave, freshly back from attending the funeral of Pope Francis, posted an AI image of himself on social media dressed as the Pope. The image was later shared on the White House official Twitter account, and when asked by a reporter if he had any thoughts on who should be elected next, he joked that I'd like to be the Pope. Now, that sort of attitude is exactly what many of the cardinals did not want to see when they thought about the prospect of a potential American. Despite having elected 3 non-Italian pontiffs in a row, a Pole, a German, and an Argentine, the conventional wisdom was that tapping someone from the world's largest superpower to head the world's smallest state would just be a bridge too far. But these, I would argue, are unconventional times. On May 7th, the morning that the cardinals entered into the conclave, I published a piece in Foreign Policy magazine suggesting that perhaps precisely because of Trump, that the idea of an American pope had become a bit more palatable among the men tasked with electing the next pope. Just weeks before the conclave, when J.D. Vance was in Rome for Easter, Cardinal Parolin lamented that the United States no longer seemed interested in engaging in the sort of multilateralism that had long defined the Vatican's approach to foreign policy. In an interview with the Italian daily La Repubblica, he said, quote, "It is clear that the current U.S. administration's approach is very different to what we're used to, and especially in the West. Perhaps this changing world order," I argued, fueled by an increased American isolationism and disregard for multinationalism that had long defined the Vatican's approach to foreign policy after the Second World War, had put the new Trump administration on a potential collision course with the Vatican and perhaps many other traditional allies. As the cardinals met in Rome for their closed-door meetings in the lead-up to the conclave, they not only discussed the internal needs of the Catholic Church, but many of them were also asking what sort of leader they wanted to help them navigate this global realignment. That's when the name Cardinal Robert Prevost began to surface and then reverberate around the room. Prevost, 69 at the time, was the head of the Vatican's powerful office that helps identify potential bishops around the world. The Chicago-born Prevost had spent the bulk of his adult life in Italy and Peru, and as the former head of the Augustinian religious order that operates in 50 countries around the world, he had extensive experience and exposure among many of the world's cardinals that were responsible for electing the next pope. He's a polyglot who had an ability to help that allowed him to communicate with almost all of the cardinals in the room, and he was deeply invested in a vision of what Pope Francis had called a better kind of politics, one that prioritizes concern for the common good over any one particular country's borders. In an interview just 2 years before he became Pope, Cardinal Prevost said that a Catholic bishop, quote, "is not supposed to be a little prince sitting in his kingdom, but instead is called to be authentically humble, to be close to the people he serves, to walk with them and to suffer with them." And in working on my book on the election of Pope Leo, many of the men that went into the Sistine Chapel told me that they believe that this is the type of leadership that could draw a stark contrast from what is being witnessed elsewhere in the world, on the world stage right now. When white smoke appeared on the afternoon of May 8th, I was on set with NBC and NBC in Rome. We were on the rooftop of the Augustinianum, which is the headquarters of the Augustinian order, where coincidentally Robert Prevost lived and worked during his 10 years as the head of the order, and where just up until the day before the conclave began, he would go for daily mass and then later again for lunch. There's about, some of you probably remember this well, there's about an hour of time to fill from the time white smoke appears and before the new pope appears on the balcony. And it's a rather intense moment, and adrenaline is running high, and there's just full of speculation. And also on set was Bishop Robert Barron, the founder of Word on Fire Ministries. And this is what Father Dan alluded to earlier. And he had said to me off camera that after such a quick election that it had to be Cardinal Parolin. Then he turned and said, who do you think it's going to be? And I said, I think it's Prevost. And he laughed at me and he said, that's a pure fantasy that only Vatican watchers like myself could dream up. Eventually, however, we had the moment that we'd all been waiting for, where the Cardinal Deacon walked out to announce the words, Habemus Papam. I'm rather lousy at Latin, but I'd been studying the Latin names of the leading candidates pretty well, and so when I heard the words Robertum Franciscum, I smiled and felt a bit vindicated, and I tried to catch Bishop Barron's eye, but he didn't want to make eye contact with me. Everyone on set began screaming, unsure who the name was in Latin, and then I yelled, "It's the American," and I may have used more colorful language than that. That's when everyone realized that history was being made. And then a few minutes later, there stood on the balcony Cardinal Robert Prevost, the man who I had gotten to know 2 years earlier in Rome. But instead of Cardinal Robert Prevost, he had taken the new name Pope Leo XIV. He delivered a speech that he had quickly handwritten right after his election. But in less than 500 words, he gave us an early blueprint of what I think we can expect in the years ahead. In that short speech of 500 words, we heard the word peace 9 times. It's a word we've continued to hear from him more than any other since his election, and quite frankly, I think it's the front burner issue of this papacy. But critically, he also said he believed in a church that is synodal. He had used the word that many of the debates inside the conclave, inside the general congregations before the conclave, had hinged on. How much more would they pursue the path of synodality that Francis had set out? Cardinal Prevost, now as Pope Leo XIV, was giving a strong endorsement that the church would be a synodal church. He also said he believed in a church that is missionary and bridge building, and the way in which he framed it drew all sorts of parallels for me to the todos, todos, todos church that we heard from Pope Francis, a church that is open to everyone, everyone, and everyone. That bridge building, however, will not be an easy task, as we've seen already in the early months of Leo on the job. But he seems to be determined to try to bring down the temperatures on a number of hot-button issues, both inside the church and outside of it. But it's proving to be an uphill climb. Right after his election, one prominent supporter of Trump immediately dismissed Leo as, quote, a woke Marxist pope. Steve Bannon, the talk show host and former White House advisor, didn't hesitate to predict that, quote, there's definitely going to be friction between the new pope and the American president. Pope Leo may have spent the majority of his adult life outside of the United States, but unfortunately, it seems, he's not going to be able to outrun the polarization that has poisoned the church in his homeland. As Pope, he's now poised to remind the world, however, that the church's Catholic social teaching doesn't map well onto the American political landscape. A pope who opposes abortion, speaks out on behalf of migrants and victims of climate change will, in the words of one of his Augustinian confreres that I spoke with after his election, quote, greatly please and occasionally disappoint conservatives and will greatly please and occasionally disappoint liberals. During his opening speech the night of his election, Leo said he had a dream of, quote, a united church searching all together for peace and justice, working together as women and men, faithful to Jesus Christ, without fear, proclaiming Christ to be missionaries faithful to the gospel. For his Augustinian brother, Father Dan O'Reilly, he said to me, quote, that's the libretto. He's giving us a foundation to start to talk to one another. That, I would say, is the opportunity and invitation of Leo's papacy. He is inviting the church in his own homeland to respond to that invitation to start talking to one another. But it will be an uphill climb, and with my esteemed panelists, we'll discuss what that means after the bar break.
Great job, Chris, for setting the table. What we are going to do now before the bar break in a move toward efficiency is introduce our other panelists, and then we'll do a break and then come back, and I've got a number of questions. You have note cards. You're welcome to write out any questions you have, and we will likely get to those. So we have, we'll go first with Susan Mulheron, who is a friend and colleague here in the Archdiocese. Susan Mulheron holds a licentiate in canon law from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., and a doctorate in canon law from the Pontifical University of Holy Cross in Rome. And I would just note this context here. Susan pursued and obtained a doctorate while being a mother, a spouse, and the Chancellor for Canonical Affairs, and defended it in Italian. That is impressive. Susan has been serving as Chancellor for Canonical Affairs for the Archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis since 2013. Her areas of canonical expertise include chancery practice, church governance, and canonical processes and jurisprudence related to delicts against the Sixth Commandment. Susan is a wife and mother, as I noted, an advocate for restorative justice and other restorative practices to help address various harms experienced in the church, particularly those arising from sexual abuse and misconduct. And Susan just presented to our law students yesterday, as she has the last number of years, and really told the story of our own archdiocese moving from harm to healing. And again, as we both noted, we're never there. You've never arrived. There needs to be constant vigilance in this area. But Susan, what I also noted is early on, she had a very clear advocacy for survivors that really ended up leading the way in the chancery. We have Professor William T. Cavanaugh with a C. Please note that, not a K. And he is Professor of Catholic Studies and Director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University. He was here at the University of St. Thomas for a number of years, and a number of his colleagues remember him very fondly, including our own Tom Berg, with whom I think you taught here at the law school. His degrees are from the universities of Notre Dame, Cambridge, and Duke. That's not a bad trio. He is author of 9 books, most recently, The Uses of Idolatry, Oxford University Press, and editor of 8 more, as well as co-editor of the Journal of Modern Theology. He has lectured on 6 continents, and his work has been published in 19 languages. Bill will be back here at Assumption Parish and their Center for Catholic Social Thought, I believe, on the 10th? The 9th of October, so you can see him and hear him. I was in New York with Bill, and he was on a panel, and I was just so struck by his insight, his intelligence, his faith, and he will share that with us today. And lastly, we have Dr. Carolyn Wu, a well-respected educator, speaker, and organizational thought leader who is committed to serving those on the margins, working for justice, and caring for our common home. During the period of 2012 to 2016, Dr. Wu served as president and CEO of Catholic Relief Services, the official international humanitarian agency of the Catholic community in the United States and one of the largest and most well-respected in that area. Prior to coming to CRS, Dr. Wu served for 14 years as Dean of the University of Notre Dame's Mendoza College of Business. During her tenure, the Mendoza College was frequently recognized as the nation's leading business school in ethics, education, and research. Dr. Wu was born and raised in Hong Kong and immigrated to the United States to attend Purdue University. She is author of Working for a Better World, recounting her faith journey and work at CRS, and Rising, learning from women's leadership in Catholic ministries. She is married to her husband, Dr. David Barkas, and they reside in South Bend, Indiana. And I had a wonderful opportunity to be seated next to Dr. Wu at the dinner following the Link lecture, and we had a great conversation. She is a woman of great faith and great wisdom, and so we welcome all of our panelists. The bar is now open. We'll be back in about 10 minutes, and we're also going to put up the slide of GHR because we are very thankful for their support. While Carolyn is coming back, I do want to recognize one of our IRGH advisory board members, who's now our chair of the advisory board, Monique Maddox, who is a wonderful leader. And so thanks to Monique for her leadership, all the work that she's doing. So reconvening here, Chris talked about where he was, right? He was working when the news came in. This is going to be the only question I answer, along with the 3 other panelists. But describe where you were when you heard the news of the white smoke and when you later learned that the new Pope, Cardinal Prevost, was an American. What were your thoughts? What were you feeling when you heard this news? And Carolyn, will go first with you.
Okay, I was at home about to have lunch. When I heard that, I thought, oh my Lord, it must be the Holy Spirit.
It's beautiful. Great.
Yeah, I was in front of the computer because I was on some network and they were waiting for the to kind of give commentary. But I was really kind of overwhelmed in some ways. I really became emotional about it. And in part just due to my own narcissism, because he's like me, right? He's from the Chicago suburbs and, went to Catholic school and spent time in Latin America, that sort of thing. He was a Sox fan, I was a Cubs fan, but we, rode our bikes to this, Dairy Queen and, that sort of thing. So there was something that I found really kind of moving about that. But the other thing that really struck me immediately was his serenity.
Yeah.
He came out and it's as if he knew he was going to be Pope and this is the most natural thing in the world. And I found that really moving. Anybody else would be thunderstruck by being just named Pope, and he just seemed to step right into the role. And there was something really kind of beautiful and calming about that.
Were you surprised that it was an American?
Oh yeah. No, I had been saying like everybody else that it could never be an American. So
Okay.
Everybody except for Chris Wright, of course. Yeah.
Susan?
I was working at the Archdiocese, and so we had pretty much the entire staff in a large conference room, and Archbishop Hebda was actually sitting very close to me at the same table, and we're watching it, and I kind of had a similar moment because I was following, the cardinals very closely because I'm a canon law nerd, and this is what I do, and I heard Robertus, and I was like, Prevost, and then they said it, and then Archbishop Hebda jumped out of his seat, and he will be the first to tell you that he does not jump to anything. And he jumped out of his seat, and he starts yelling across the room to the entire staff, telling them, oh, he's an American. And anything he could think of about him. He's the prefect of the dicastery for bishops. He was a missionary in Peru. And he just shouting to the room with excitement. And I think that was really, the whole moment was so beautiful, like you expressed. But it was fun to see Archbishop just effectively jumping up and down like this, and then interpreting the speech in Italian and in Spanish for us. Live, and so it was a kind of a privileged experience to go through that with Archbishop.
That's great. Susan, let's stay with you for a minute because you early on, you always go to the safeguarding conference that Father Hans Zollner hosts in June, and so you had an opportunity to meet the new Pope and have a beautiful picture, and you were able to talk with him. Explain that a little bit, because that's a cool story.
So I was in Rome this past June for the conference, like you said, and I asked if Archbishop could see if he could get me a little encontro with the Pope, and he was able to do that. So I was able to meet him briefly after the Wednesday general audience. Let me just talk more about that.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you would ask me, how do you, I knew I'd only have about 30 seconds to have a conversation with him. And so, what do you say to a Pope in that kind of context and with that kind of brevity? And so, as I was thinking about him, I wanted him to, I needed to bring greetings from the Archbishop. So I checked that off, and I made sure he understood where I was from and why I was here in Rome. And I wanted him to know that, because I also wanted to express to him that his election is a great source of hope for me. And for a lot of the reasons I think we're going to be talking about, but because I was in Rome for the Safeguarding Conference, and what I do as part of my work and my great hope for him and his background and what he will bring to that area of our church, that's so badly needed.
Great. Thank you. Just briefly, in terms of my own reaction, we were at the Basilica. We had a staff meeting. I did say to our staff, I said, it could be an American. And that's because I'd read Chris's biography. But or his kind of lead up, his profile, but it was really his extraordinary background that really caught me. I'm like, wow, this guy has been everywhere. He's done everything. He's a good manager. He's a missionary. So that really struck me when we were with Johann and our other two managing directors, and Johann's plugged into the Vatican, and he gets the alerts, and he said, there's white smoke. So I said it's either Carolyn or Prevost, because I figured if it's a four ballots, it's somebody who's known, somebody that they've coalesced around, maybe not an extraordinary surprise candidate. The staff had a watch party, and I, like I did with Francis, I just went up. I have a room above my office, and I just wanted to watch by myself. And Johann, God bless him, did the interviews with the news, and it was just remarkable. And I was, Bill, moved as well. I was really emotionally moved by what he said, how he carried himself, his serenity, his prayerfulness, just really, really moving. So, and Chris, anything else from you? You have this role, or had this role as a reporter, so you have to be totally plugged in there. Anything other than knowing that you were right and Bishop Barron wasn't? Did it sink in that it's an American, or what might be going on?
Sure. The only thing I'll add, and it's similar to what Bill was talking about, the serenity. One of the things that I had sort of thought about in the days leading up to the conclave and talked about with my colleagues who covered the Vatican day in and day out was, who we could actually physically see in our minds as Pope. What would they look like as Pope? And I could, even though I had written two pieces saying that Prevost was a real contender, I had a hard time imagining him coming out on the balcony in my mind, what that would look like. And so I was struck by two things. One, how natural it seemed for him, because he was someone who I'd gotten to know for the previous 2 years in Rome, who shied away from the public spotlight, and then all of a sudden the cameras of the world were on him, and it seemed as if he was kind of okay with that, and that was surprising. And then the other thing that I experienced, not so much that day, but in the following days, after his election was, and I don't know how to say this except it totally demystified the office of the papacy for me. To see someone who you knew before they were Pope become Pope made you realize that, of course, the Holy Spirit is involved in all of that. He's, hopefully riding on the prayers of many. But he's also just trying to rise to the occasion as someone who's been tasked with a job that he never wanted, and I think that's a very good thing to have happen.
Yeah, they did the interviews with a number of the American cardinals, and Cardinal Tobin has known him for years because they were both in Rome, leading their respective orders. And he said at one point when the votes were coming in and it was certain that he was going to be elected, he just put his hands in his head, and Tobin said he wondered what that does to somebody, knowing that weight is on your shoulders. But then that contrasted with the serenity just moments later is really remarkable. And one
of the interesting things, this is not in my book, but Cardinal Tobin said this in some public forum, so I'm not saying anything out of turn here. He said a few days prior to the election that they were in some room together, and he basically just patted him on his back and he said, "Bob, this may fall to you." And
wow. Yeah. The one thing we'll come back to in a few minutes is the interesting thing that his reputation as media shy was pretty kind of put out there, and he gave a major interview before Pope Francis did in his papacy, and I was really surprised that he waded into the American situation, which I'm going to get into in a little bit. So he's not. It's hard to put him in boxes, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Okay, to all of the panelists, and we'll start with Susan and then go down. What are the aspects of Pope Leo's biography that most impress you and will best serve him as successor of Peter And then what really gives you hope for this papacy?
Sure. For sure, it's the diversity of experience that he has. When I look at him with all of that background and everything, and just what we've seen and how he carries himself and how he answers questions and how he's doing the job, I see someone who has what I would call like the full package, who's strong intellectually, but also pastorally, and has all that diverse experience to draw from. That's a wonderful foundation to have in the Holy Father.
Yeah, that's great. Bill?
Yeah, and he's got that diversity right in his own biography, right? You know, the Creole roots and all of the different kinds of influences in his bloodstream. And one of the things that I've found so interesting, like a young priest that I know that had actually worked with him in Peru sent a picture around right after he was elected of Prevost on a donkey. And I just love that. And there, you know, there were several pictures like that floating around, but the idea that he had been riding up, you know, into the hinterlands in this obscure diocese in Peru, you know, getting to remote villages on a donkey, I think that's really going to serve him well to keep him grounded as the successor to Peter. And also in that diocese too, it's really interesting that it had been an Opus Dei diocese for the last two bishops, I think, you know, over the period of 30 years or something like that. And Opus Dei is not only known as conservative theologically, but also in Peru especially, linked to kind of right-wing politics in Peru. He came in, he had a different style, he changed things around, but without alienating the Opus Dei priests that are there. And from all the reports, it was really, that's kind of remarkable that he's sort of, you know, gently taking the diocese in a different direction, but bringing everybody along with him. And I think that really bodes well for the church.
What I noticed in some of the reporting from Peru, the diocese where he was bishop, is that he wasn't a micromanager. And they interviewed the rector of the cathedral there, and he said he only told me one thing that he wanted. He wanted him to hear confessions in an alb. And so I think of our own Archbishop, who, thank goodness, is not a micromanager. He allows the parishes and the leadership to do their things. I now hear them in an alb, confessions, because I think if the Pope wants it, then there must be some good reason why. But that sort of trust in the people that you work with, you know, and that came out in the reporting. Carolyn, what most impresses you?
Well, so first of all, there is absolute nothing to not like.
Right.
You know, from the time he was a child and, you know, his whole education, his ease with people, his gifts, you know, he was both intellectual, he loved to sing, he was athletic, he was smart, and, you know, he was a missionary, he was an administrator. You know, it's interesting that both Pope Francis and now Pope Leo were superior. They were the provincial and head of their congregations. I mean, that's really amazing. But what really caught my eye, I mean, there were so many things that he was a mechanic, he could do that and all those things. But what really caught me was that he had lunch every day with the Augustinians. I don't know, you know, a lot of very busy people, it's probably interesting to look at their lunch calendars. Are they with donors? Do they tend to be by themselves? But I think that whole commitment of wanting to be with his brothers and a commitment to be with his brothers, a sense of sort of where the young Augustinians are, you know, the people who are there studying, that really sort of told me about how this person sees his role and the importance of that presence as commitment.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And you would be a terrific, if you have one more job left, you could be a spokesperson. That was beautiful. Chris, what most impresses you?
I think certainly his background as a missionary, I think is key to understanding who he is. But Bill touched on that very well. So I will pivot and offer another perspective. I'm very impressed as the fact that he is an outsider who understands how to get things done inside the Vatican. And I think he realizes, we've seen just in these early days, he's given a speech sort of where he's in a sense made nice to the Roman Curia, the Vatican central bureaucracy, saying, he's made it clear he wants to work with them. That being said, I think he's going to bring, shall I say, more sort of a North American style of governance in an institution that could benefit from it. And he won't hesitate to bring in lay experts, particularly when it comes to issues like finances, communications, and issues that the Vatican has historically struggled to sort of get their sort of mind around. And I think he's open to that. And so I think the credibility of what he will preach as Pope has to be backed by an institution that has its own house in order, and that is an ongoing process.
Great, thank you. Carolyn, we're going to come to you for a couple of questions. Cardinal Prevost took the name of Leo XIV. What significance do you draw from this, particularly as the former head of Catholic Relief Services and somebody who has manifested a deep compassion for folks on the margins?
So I just want to say, not just as head of CRS, but I was also the dean of a business school, the dean of a Catholic business school, to try to understand what is Catholic about business. So clearly the fact that, Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, the first Catholic social teaching principle on how do we act, it was not just principles. It was a whole idea of an age where capitalism and labor, the abuse and the exploitation of labor by capital at that point, he did several things. He basically said labor had rights, and he defined some of those rights, in addition, including unionization, for example, but the dignity of that work and the fair treatment of that work. So I just want to say, more than 100 years later, as we go into the 2000s, 2020s and so on, what we see is that the disparity between the owners of capital and the owners of labor is like, the returns to the owners of capital, which, by the way, is all of us. If you have a retirement fund, we are owners of capital. The returns to the owners of capital keep shooting up, and labor wages were just flat. It was just really flat. It's like this. And I think to take on that issue again, the inequality of people who have capital and the people who work for people with capital, it's just the disparity is tragic and is uncalled for. And so for him to take up this fight now, and of course, he also mentioned artificial intelligence, which would do so much good. For example, a lot of our diagnoses and so on would benefit from it, but it would displace people. And one of the things we learned, particularly when I work with the Vatican on the energy transition, and one of the things we learned was that even though we have to go away from fossil fuels, there are many people employed related to coals and other forms, and that we have to take care of a just transition. What does it look like? I mean, we cannot hold back technology either. We should not hold back, the movement towards clean energy. But again, it's not just a mindless abandonment of all the people who are affected, who will lose their jobs. So I think this is exactly the time for a Pope who would take on this, the whole issue between labor, capital, and the transition. And transition takes place and it tends to benefit people who can. But the other thing is that Leo XIII also recognized something that people never talk about, and that is he argued for the right of private property. He was not for socialism. He believed that labor should be treated correctly, but that private property is also a right. And I think that I do not know why people were so against Francis when he took on the criticism of capitalism, because capitalism does not work if there is no trust. Trust requires regulation and so on. So number one, I'm just really so, and I think he has the sophistication also to be able to manage this path, is not to hold back technology, but is not to speak up against private property, but to understand the proper balance of those two working together. And I just want to say, in the end, Leo is a lion. The lion and the lamb. We just really need to sort of be able to fight for those things.
Great, thank you. I'm going to stay on the topic of Catholic social teaching and Bill, to you. Catholic social teaching is often described as the Church's best kept secret. In my opinion, too few bishops and priests preach and teach about Catholic social teaching, and many of them don't know the contours and nuances that are part of it. Would you describe for us Catholic social teaching, its values and goals, and how can CST, which it's often referred to as, foster greater justice, flourishing, and peace in our present day? And also, not to add so much here, but what is the pushback in the United States, where people will pick and choose what dimensions, or they'll change it to fit their political needs?
And you want me to keep my answer
Yes,
brief, right?
Crisp, yes, crisp.
2 minutes, okay.
I know you can do it.
Okay, so Catholic social teaching it's not as if it happened first in 1891. I mean, the prophets and Jesus talked about social issues, but for the first time in Rerum Novarum, you have a pope directly addressing social, political, economic issues of the day under the circumstances that Carolyn mentioned. And so from this then comes a body of work, encyclicals and other reflections, in which the Church tries to kind of set forth a vision of a decent society. And so a number of principles kind of are articulated out of this: the dignity of the human person, the common good as opposed to just kind of self-interest, subsidiarity, that you want to do things at as low a level as you can, solidarity, that we all belong to one another, rights and responsibilities, care for our common creation, and so on. So you get these principles, and the problem with principles, of course, is that they then need to be made concrete. And so, as you said, people pick and choose. It's possible to kind of take the principle of subsidiarity and make that into an argument for tax cuts for the wealthy, because you're, smaller government and so on. So there's lots of different ways of reading this, but I think maybe the best way of reading Catholic social thought, and this is kind of picking up on some of what Carolyn was talking about with labor and capital, is it's a third way between capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. And so you have this situation where capitalism says that the owners of capital are those who kind of own the means of production, and the profits go there. And then socialists will say the state should own the means of production. And Catholic social thought comes along and talks about the rights of the workers and private property in such a way that you get this whole kind of idea in Catholic social thought that the problem isn't too many capitalists, the problem is not enough capitalists, right? That instead of either the state or a small elite of the wealthy owning the means of production, that the means of production ought to be owned much more broadly, that workers should own the means of production. So neither this elite of the rich nor the state. And so the universal destination of goods then means that property is owned for the sake of the common good, and it's not just up to whoever happens to have the most stuff to determine that the right of private property is not an absolute right, but is one that is always relative to the suffering in the world. So Thomas Aquinas says, yes, private property is a good, but it should be held as if it were common in order to distribute it to whoever has need. And so it's this kind of third way in a situation in which you've got these extremes, and it's a vision of what a sane economy, a sane society would look like.
That's great. So when next time I teach Catholic social thought, that clip will be played to my law students when we talk about the principles, because you described all of them beautifully, but the interplay and the fact that it's a third way. And as a third way, it can bridge divides, and it can build bridges because it's not an ideology, it's a moral framework.
Yeah. And I think, if I could say one more thing on that, my kids, when they went to Catholic grade school, they had the same geography text as the kids that went in economics is part of that, as the kids who went to public school. Whereas I was once staying with my godparents in Winona, Minnesota, and I found this book, a Catholic school geography textbook from 1952, which has this entire vision of what a Catholic economy is about, and the common good, and this, profile of this town in Iowa that has all of these cooperative enterprises and everything. And I thought, this is wonderful, not just for what it says, but for the idea that Catholics have a view of what a sane economy and a sane world looks like, and we shouldn't put that under a bushel basket, that this is something that we ought to be talking about.
Great, thank you very much. Susan, some of the early reporting attests to the fact that Pope Leo has a history of working effectively with women and has emphasized the gifts of laity as well, the laity during his tenure as a bishop in Peru. Why is this important for the life and good of the Church? I know that you have an excellent working relationship with Archbishop Hebda and also a friendship. By the way, she gets to call him Bernie. I don't call him Bernie. But in any event, please describe how this is life-giving for your work and why it's important for the life of the Church.
Okay, thank you for that question. I mentioned that when I was preparing for my brief conversation with Pope Leo, I said, you give me hope. And one of the sources for that hope is his American roots that bring that kind of pragmatism that you mentioned, but also that in coming up to meet him, I felt like I was about to have a conversation with any other American bishop, which is a demographic I feel quite comfortable working with. I work with many bishops, I work for a lot of bishops, and I've had that sense of ease that plus it didn't hurt that we could speak English, versus, I did get a chance to meet Pope Francis, and I was a bundle of nerves. Again, the language is maybe part of it, but I didn't have that sense of connection and relatability in the same way that I've automatically felt with Pope Leo. But to kind of get back to your question, so when I say, your election gives me hope, part of it is that sort of expectation, really, that he will model what we love about our American bishops in terms of, I think most of them have a great ease at working with women and laity and welcome them to the table, and he can model that, I think, on a global level. And then he's in a position to maybe identify where there's deficits in that and other places in the Church and give advice and set the tone, really, for what leadership looks like in terms of its engagement with laity and women. And so I'm very excited to see where that goes.
Sure. And I know she was appointed by Pope Francis, and she's been to Basilica of St. Mary, Sister Raffaella Petrini. My hope is that the most capable people in terms of the governance of the Church will be in those positions. I mean, that seems like a good way to run an organization, and he does seem early on to keep that. Carolyn, I want to turn to you. You spoke this morning beautifully and in such a balanced way, in my opinion, to a group of maybe 14 of us, mostly women. There were 3 guys there. What you came at it and you said, at one point, and you said a number of things, but we don't want to get into the a clericalist way of looking at the role of women either. You said absolutely we should push for women in more leadership positions. You noted the difference between women in the church, the percentages, and women running universities and in secular society. It's actually quite higher in the church. But briefly, any thoughts on this question?
So, cutting to a very brief summary of women in the church, but I want to say one thing about Catholic social teaching. I think the label got us into the wrong direction. First of all, it's not Catholic, it's gospel teachings. Americans do not like the word social. Immediately is socialism. So I think that what we say is Catholic social thought. A lot of the writing, was done, with Leo XIII and different people, but it's really gospel responsibilities. I don't know whether we could, in some ways, call it by different names for people to not have so much sort of resentment and antagonism. And the word social is really sort of where it catches people. But I want to come back to Dan's question on women very briefly. People say, do women have any influence in the church? Do they actually have significant roles in ministry? And fast statistics, about a third of Catholic hospitals, which are multi-hundred-million-dollar operations, 1/3 of Catholic universities are run by women. 1/2 of Catholic charities are run by women. School principals, about 2/3 are women. Superintendents, about 1/2. So if you compare those numbers, 1/3 to 2/3, the percentage of CEOs in Fortune 500 is 8%. The percentage of women in the largest universities as CEOs is about 20%. So if you look at the church ministries, really the role of women is undebatable. I mean, you actually wonder why people ask that question. But where the why is, as we advocate for women being ordained, an unintended message that came across is, if you are not a priest, you're nobody. It doesn't matter what you do until women are accepted into ordination. Look, women are chancellors. Women are chief human resource officers. They're the chief legal officers. They're the chief financial officers. In diocesan management. I mean, those are important positions. So when you come back, because in the advocacy for women as priests, the fight is like, it doesn't matter if you don't make us priests. Everything is lost. Nothing counts. That's a type of clericalism which women are practicing on women. And it actually distorts how young women look at their potential role in the church, because they only conclude there's nothing for us. You don't even know where the door is that you could knock. And it's all based on the fact that when we fight for that, we diminish the other ministries of the church. So there's also clericalism in the sense that male or priest practice. Dan is not the example here, but honestly, there's a lot of snootiness and arrogance and sort of like little kings in parishes, because that's what the canon law supposedly allowed them to be. I don't know, as they say, that the decision makers, they don't consult well, they act on preferences without really sort of triangulating where things are. So I just want to say that, but that I think the importance of women already exists. I mean, it used to be 5 or 6 years ago, I could keep track of the Vatican appointments of women in big roles. But now I lost count. I think there's 50 or 60, the head of the Vatican City, particularly where money is. I guess I'm a business school dean. People don't hand over revenue generating operations, lightly. So the head of the Vatican City and the head of the Vatican Museum are women. We have a prefect now, which is the highest level. We have, secretaries, which is the second level. We have undersecretaries, and so many of them. And women now have voting rights. And I just want to conclude, I think, people say, oh, Pope Francis didn't go far enough, there's still no women priests. But what he did when he changed the Curia infrastructure, the whole organization, from these pontifical councils, they already sort of lift you up, to dicastery. And I always have to explain to people, dicastery is just an office. The office of this and the office of that, cloak it in a little bit of sort of Vatican speak, dicastery. And by doing that, he actually also removed governance from sacramental ordination. And that's a big move. And so I actually am very positive about the role of women. I don't think ordination of women will come anytime soon. I think the women diaconate is a very difficult fight. But I think that we are plowing that front, and also the front of allowing lay preachers within the context of a mass. Lay people can speak in a church. It's just not within the mass where the Eucharist is also being celebrated. I think those are fronts that we would be fighting.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn, very much. Chris, I was struck, so at the end of your keynote, you talked about what Pope Francis could, kind of the light that he could bring to the American church. And there was about, I think, a 3-hour interview that'll be the basis for an upcoming book from the Crux, your former counterpart at Crux. And one thing that Pope Leo said is, well, they're not going to be able to say what they said about Pope Francis, that he doesn't understand the American church. I found that interesting that he said that. And now there's this recent dust-up with regard to the fact that Senator Durbin was going to receive a kind of a Lifetime Achievement Award as it pertained to his work on behalf of migrants over his career. And for the Archdiocese of Chicago, there was a lot of pushback, and he decided to decline that. And certainly Catholic social teaching promotes a consistent life ethic. And again, I was surprised that the Pope weighed in just the other day, and he kind of waded into that area. What do you make of this? What's your thought on his relationship with the American bishops, but also how he came at that issue of Catholic social thought?
Sure, it's a lot there. I think, for starters, one of the things that an American cardinal who participated in the conclave said to me in the days after the election, he said, Pope Leo may have just been elected Pope, but he would probably not be able to be elected as a committee head at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And I think there is some truth to that. But I also think that hints at an opportunity as well, because he doesn't carry the baggage of the divisiveness of the U.S. Church. And he was never a member of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So I think that, in a sense, makes him more of a freer agent to operate. I think he's someone who temperamentally is not going to be looking for a fight. I think on any of the sort of neuralgic issues, he would rather, we'll take migration. I think he's indicating that he wants the U.S. bishops to take the lead there. And for them to sort of be the first line of defense, and particularly to act in unison. But I think he'll also, use his voice when necessary. His decision to weigh in on Monday, I think it was Monday evening, about the Durbin debate shows a few things. One, I think it shows that he's paying close attention to the church in his home country. He knows the debates well. As he said in the interview, he can't be accused of not knowing the dynamics of the U.S. Church. I think the comments he made on Monday night are the most substantive things he said since he was elected. I think it shows a continuity with Francis's approach to life issues. Francis, of course, had the line that the lives of the unborn and the lives of migrants are equally sacred. And then when we were, I think it was exactly a year ago, last September, when Pope Francis was coming back from his 2-week trip in Asia, and we asked him about this on the plane on the eve of the U.S. election, about sort of how Catholics should vote. He rejected the U.S. bishops' sort of language of preeminent priority or single issue voting, and he cast a very different vision of what it means to be pro-life. And I think Leo made it very clear where he stands on that debate. So there may be a handful of bishops that are rattled by the situation in Chicago, but they now have a pope that's made it clear where he stands. So he's looking to build bridges, not looking for a fight, but also I think he's trying to also kind of pull the U.S. Church along with him.
Right, and there's other places when he was bishop and maybe even cardinal where he was very clear on the teaching with regard to life in the womb.
Yeah, I don't think Francis said when he would talk about abortion, he said he would talk about it in terms that would have gotten any other pope, I think, crucified. The very blunt language. He often, talked about abortion as being comparable to a hitman, and I think that sort of language, if it had come up from Benedict or John Paul, everyone would have been shocked by. Right. So Francis didn't mince words on the abortion issue either, but he was trying to put it in a much larger framework.
Right, which is the heart of Catholic social teaching, the dignity of every human life across the continuum of life. We're going to take just a quick comment for you. The bar is going to close at 5. So this, because I talked about the rich humanity of all of our, they're not going to be offended if you get up and get a glass of wine or a beer. We're going to keep going. With regard to the questions, Izzy, maybe you can collect the questions. I'm going to ask a couple more. If we don't get to questions, what I'm going to ask of our panelists is we're going to submit the questions to them, just when they get back to their particular worlds, to just a brief response to some of the questions. We won't make them work too hard, but we do want to make sure that we get questions in. I want to go to Bill and say, you have traveled broadly, all of our panelists have traveled broadly. I just mainly stay here in the Twin Cities. But what does it mean that we have a new pope who is a citizen of the world? 47, 50 countries in his ministry as the head of the Augustinian order. And how will this help him in his ministry as Peter?
Yeah, it's a big church, right? 1.4 billion spread over the world. I tell my students all the time that the Catholic Church is probably the first truly global organization and still is the only truly grassroots global institution. And so it's a very diverse thing. People think of Catholics as being monolithic, and it's not that way at all. And so a diversity of experiences that he has across many different continents, I think is going to serve him really well. Our universities oftentimes pitch this idea that travel in and of itself is enriching and enlightening and makes you a better person. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think you can travel the world over and still be a jerk. And you can, become just a kind of consumer of experiences and just stuffing the self with the lives of others and the experiences of others. So I think it's really crucial that he doesn't just have experience kind of globetrotting, but again, he's on that donkey, right? And he's got that experience of being with people on the margins in a sustained long-term way that indicates that sort of solidarity. And that's precisely the kind of experience then so it's not just kind of horizontal experience, the kind of traveling the world, but it's the traveling the gap between the rich and the poor. Mm-hmm. It's that vertical kind of dimension where he's been up and down that scale. And I think that's really going to serve him well.
Great, thank you. Just staying with Bill for a minute, we're hearing his first apostolic, maybe exhortation, maybe coming this month in October, and then maybe early in 2026, an encyclical. We're hearing poverty is going to be the subject, if the reporting's correct, on the apostolic exhortation. Any thoughts on the first encyclical?
I don't know what it's about. I mean, if it's poverty, I think that's obviously a perennial issue and one that's very close to his heart. I've heard the possibility of him, his first major document being on artificial intelligence as well, and I don't know if that's going to be the case or not, but in some ways that's really interesting because he's made that very clear that that's an important priority for him. And it kind of looks both forwards and backwards. It's obviously something that's brand new, and it's going to change a lot of things. But it's also a kind of going back to Rerum Novarum and this question of workers, right? The really essential question, I think, for Leo in artificial intelligence is this going to put people out of work and make people redundant? And work is this kind of act of co-creation with God that John Paul II talked about. And is this going to make us somehow less than human? And so that seems to me to be a really interesting thing that he's going to need to explore.
And Benedict XVI warned in his writings and in his addresses that we always seem to progress, or what we think is progress, gets out ahead of the ethical reflection and the work of really saying, is this good for the human person? Does it promote the common good? Or are we approaching it from a utilitarian standpoint or a kind of a dehumanized standpoint? I do want to ask this question. I'm going to ask it from a couple of different vantage points, from Chris from kind of an ecclesial political standpoint, and from Susan from a canonical standpoint. And maybe in her answering, as we start to close up shop here, she can say what it means to have a pope who's a canonist. I can't remember, it's been a number of years, I think. So this is from the audience, so nobody can accuse me of not taking, I'm kidding. What's the way to handle the question of the Tridentine Mass? Is it toleration? It's an issue of polarization. Certainly, I can't read the other part of it. But how is this handled? Do you think that he may go in a different direction? There was some reporting that he had, Cardinal Burke and that group were able to celebrate in a particular way at St. Peter's. I remember when I read, and I was a fan of Pope Francis, when I read that document, it came in on a Saturday, I was in my chapel, and I went, wow, that's strong. And I kind of, with a pastor's head and heart, kind of was going, maybe that might be a little stronger than it needed to be. So, Chris, you first, and then Susan.
Next question. Okay. I think Pope Francis acted in the manner in which he did because he was deeply concerned about the reception of the Second Vatican Council, and he saw this dangerous tie between, some adherence to the traditional Latin Mass and acceptance of the Council. Was there an overreach? Did he pick the wrong battle? I think there's good consideration to be had on that question. I think Leo, these are early days. I think he's trying to meet with as many people as possible. He's been Pope, 4 months. I think he's modeling Catholic social teaching, see, judge, act. I think he's wanting to hear, best cases from everyone. I don't expect there to be any sort of major rollback of the document of Traditionis Custodes. I suspect he'll probably have some sort of olive branch toward the more traditionalist crowd, but I don't think that he'll radically undo what Francis did. I also think he probably thinks it's a very privileged debate for us to be having when the world is at war.
Yeah, amen to that. I think that's very well said, because, not that it isn't consequential for folks, but at the end of the day, Christ is our center. And sometimes it does seem the attention that's put on this is idolatrous. And so, and Susan, maybe in answering the question, and we're just about to wrap, how do we handle it in the Archdiocese?
Next question.
Well, he gave a thoughtful response. I think you will too.
Well, the great irony about whenever we talk about anything liturgical, because liturgy is supposed to be that great unifying factor for all of us, and really what else is more polarizing in the church than starting to talk about liturgy. I'm looking at Johann over there. He could probably speak to this. And so, I think we were all shocked when Traditionis Custodes came down. I don't think anybody saw it coming. It did certainly kind of hit like a bomb. And it's very difficult because it touches on the liturgy, which is so important and essential to all of us as Catholics, and it's so dear to all of us, and we all have very strong feelings about it. And because it kind of seemed to come out of nowhere, especially after experience under Pope Benedict, who was quite sympathetic and broadened permissions for this. And so, where will we go from here? I would. An olive branch from Pope Leo, I would not be surprised at. Like I said, I think we've already seen one with having the Mass celebrated by Cardinal Burke in St. Peter's Basilica. It's a doozy, I guess I would say on that. And how do you undo something like that? Well, I think he will slow roll anything. And I don't think he's a bomb dropper like Pope Francis. And I guess that would pivot into that question you asked, like, what does it mean to have a Pope who's a canonist? Oh boy, I'm so excited to have a Pope who's a canonist. It's been a really, really long time. And while like our popes in our modern era, I think about like John Paul II and Pope Benedict, they weren't canonists, but they certainly worked alongside with their canonists, and what they did was very measured and followed kind of what you would expect in terms of the canonical process. And Pope Francis was, and we all know, he was much more of a chaos agent. And there's things to love about that, and there's things that we have to maybe try to handle after that. And he was a prolific legislator. As a canon lawyer trying to keep up with Pope Francis, I woke up how many mornings at 5 a.m. checking the news out of the Vatican, and some new thing had changed. And, the Canon Law Society of America couldn't print English translations of the code because, as soon as they got the translation ready, something else had changed. And so there was a lot of instability in canon law, which in a lot of ways was really life-giving to the discipline. It had kind of settled and stagnated, I would say, for about 30 years. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but his manner of legislating raised a lot of questions that we are now trying to interpret and unpack and apply. And I'm really looking forward to Pope Leo bringing some clarity to that and some structure and settling some of these live questions that are still out there, including like what is the standing of the traditional Latin Mass.
Great, thank you. We're going to end with a word or a phrase. When I say Pope Leo XIV, what's the first word or phrase that comes to your mind or heart? Right.
One moment. Missionary.
Okay.
Love for people and gospel.
No, it's a phrase.
I used the term serenity before. I think I'm going to stick with that. Boring would be another way of saying that, and maybe we need a little bit of that. I can explain that.
Yep. I'll stick with hope. That's what I was trying to think of what I would say to him. You bring me hope.
Wonderful.
Still do.
That's a great, in this our journey, our Jubilee journey, that's a great word to end on. If we could give a round of applause to our wonderful panel. And the food is still there. Please get some food. We paid for it. The bar is just about to close, so if you want something, come on up. Thank you much. You all did a great job and very, very enlightening.